Okay, let's unpack this truly baffling question. What if everything you thought you knew about personal growth, enlightenment, and achieving inner peace was based on a single, fundamental biological mistake?
Uh-huh.
Not a philosophical failure, but a catastrophic neurological glitch embedded by centuries of culture.
That is the starting point for our deep dive today. We are looking at the sources left behind by U.G. Krishnamurti, or U.G., a man who stood against every guru, every scripture, and, well, every organized tradition.
And his claim is revolutionary. He said his ultimate transformation wasn't some mystical awakening, but a spontaneous, violent, purely physical event, a cellular calamity.
Exactly.
Our mission for you, the learner, is to quickly move past the shock value of his claims and grasp the mechanisms behind his radical anti-philosophy. Why did UG insist that the human body is this intelligent, self-sustaining machine that is constantly sabotaged by its own internal dialogue, what we call thought?
Right.
We'll trace his journey from a highly conditioned spiritual heir to the ultimate anti-guru, dissecting the precise physiological events that led him to conclude that the only real transformation is chemical, not psychological.
And the sources we have today, they read less like spiritual texts and more like, I don't know, clinical case files of a radical, spontaneous mutation. UG provided exhaustive detail on the collapse of his senses, the transformation of his organs.
So we really need to follow this material closely.
We do, because his entire argument that enlightenment is bunk and seeking is the disease, it all rests on the physical evidence of what happened to his body when his mind, the so-called psychic coordinator, finally dissolved.
Okay, let's jump straight into the strange intensity of his early life.
Now let's do it.
To understand the fury and just the completeness of Yuji's later rejection, we have to appreciate the absolute intensity of his initial conditioning.
Oh, absolutely.
He wasn't just raised in a spiritual home, he was essentially engineered to be a spiritual leader.
Engineered is the right word. Exactly. His beginnings were immediately defined by this spiritual destiny. He was born in 1918, and his mother, who died shortly after his birth, allegedly prophesied that her son was born with a high spiritual destiny.
And that wasn't just some casual family anecdote, right?
Not at all. It became the governing principle of his entire upbringing.
And the person who took up this mandate was his grandfather, T.G. Krishnamurti. He wasn't just a guardian, he was wealthy, highly influential, and he basically altered his own life to fulfill this mission.
The sources confirm this was a total commitment. His grandfather was a leading lawyer, successful, respected, but he abandoned his entire legal career, gave up everything, specifically to oversee Yuji's development.
Wow.
That level of investment, it immediately sets the stage for the kind of monumental pressure and expectation Yuji lived under.
So the environment he grew up in was this fascinating, often contradictory spiritual cauldron. It wasn't just one school of thought.
No, not at all. Yuji later called it a profoundly mixed up man's house, spiritually speaking. It was built on two often conflicting pillars.
Which were?
The extremely devout, rigid Hindu Brahminical traditions, and then the more modern global theosophical movement. So on one hand, he was subject to constant chanting, rigorous rituals, and deep readings from the most complex ancient religious texts, the Upanishads, the Panchadasi.
We're talking about highly abstract philosophical texts that even mature scholars struggle with.
And he wasn't just like skimming them.
No. His grandfather believed that early intense exposure would permanently integrate these virtues into his being. The sources say that by the time he was 8 years old, he had not only read these profound texts, but had memorized extensive complex sections of them.
By heart.
By heart. This wasn't rote learning for a test.
Yeah.
This was immersion designed to mold his very soul.
And at the same time, the house was filled with theosophical imagery, right? Pictures of leaders, including Jiddu Krishnamurti, JK, who was famously positioned as the next world teacher. So he was trained in ancient orthodoxy and modern esoteric movements simultaneously. A very strange mix.
And this intellectual rigor was matched by physical discipline.
Oh, yeah. His spiritual training was arguably the best available in India at the time. He spent 7 consecutive summers in the Himalayas, learning classical yoga directly from Swami Sivananda of Rishikesh.
One of the most famous yogis of the 20th century.
The most famous, probably. And this wasn't a retreat. This was intense, high-level physical and spiritual practice designed to achieve the highest states of consciousness.
So he had the perfect setup. Philosophical saturation, physical mastery, and complete financial and social freedom to pursue nothing but enlightenment.
But perfect foundation.
But this perfect foundation led not to bliss, but to deep, searing frustration.
By his early 20s, after decades of this rigorous pursuit, He hit a wall. He had achieved the mystical states, he had performed the penance, but he realized his internal reality was completely unchanged.
He was still.
He was still, as he put it, filled with conflict, greed, and burning anger. The exterior performance was perfect, but the interior was a mess.
And this internal conflict led him to view the masters and gurus he had revered as, well, essentially frauds.
He developed a profound disillusionment, yeah. It was based on seeing the gulf between their teachings and their actual lives. The anecdote he always returned to was discovering Swami Sivananda, his revered yoga teacher, secretly eating hot pickles behind closed doors.
That sounds so trivial.
It does sound trivial, but for UG, it was proof. Sivananda was supposed to be a non-attached yogi beyond sensory pleasures, but he was just an ordinary man indulging a craving, which proved he was no different from several other yogis.
So the implication wasn't just that the gurus were flawed, it was that the entire system was built on a lie that required you to falsify yourself.
Precisely. His core realization was brutal. His natural state, the anger, the greed, the violence, that was real. The prescribed virtues of nonviolence or non-attachment taught by Buddha or Jesus were artificial constructs.
So if he tried to adopt them,
he would be falsifying his own biological and psychological reality. He reached this existential breaking point, feeling a revulsion against everything sacred and everything holy, and concluded by age 21, I'm finished with the whole business.
But here's the great paradox you highlighted earlier. Despite feeling finished, he spent years actively promoting the very philosophy he despised.
It's incredible, isn't it? He became a lecturer for the Theosophical Society for nearly 7 years. He traveled through India, Europe, North America, lecturing on theosophy in practically every major university and college in India.
Wow.
He was the systems evangelist while internally feeling this immense nausea toward it.
What kept him in that loop if he was so cynical?
Well, functionality and habit. He had a family to support, and frankly, he realized the job was easy. He said he was just dispensing secondhand information, something anyone with some brains could do.
So he was just adapting to the cultural machinery.
Exactly. Proving that you can succeed within a system purely by mirroring its expectations, even if your conviction is zero. The knowledge was borrowed, not experienced, and this just deepened his sense of self-betrayal.
And this period overlaps with his famous but frustrating connection to Jiddu Krishnamurti, J.K.
Right. UG listened to J.K. for many years, sometimes interacting with him directly. And he recognized a unique intelligence in J.K.'s ideas. J.K. was also criticizing the structured path to enlightenment, but UG couldn't fully integrate it.
Why not?
He noted that even J.K.'s ideas, while powerful, felt like they were falsifying him. They were another set of ideas to measure himself against, another goal to fail at.
So the central issue remained.
The central issue remained. The I was still seeking an end to the I. This tension, this continuous seeking of an exit that didn't exist, created an immense psychological and physiological pressure cooker.
So by the late 1960s, he was a man overloaded with sophisticated knowledge, utterly disgusted by that knowledge, and physically stressed by decades of seeking a transformation that never came. All of this tension had to manifest somewhere.
And it did. The sources make it clear that the ultimate psychological collapse was preceded by several years of extreme, strange physical phenomena. This wasn't a gentle transition, it was a physical meltdown.
Okay, let's start with that first sign of sensory integration failure, the Casino de Paris incident. It sounds almost mystical, but UG framed it purely as a physiological breakdown.
Yeah, a breakdown of the visual psychic link. He was watching a cabaret dancer with friends, and suddenly the feeling of division dissolved. He experienced the dance not as something external, but as a peculiar kind of movement inside of me.
He couldn't tell if the dancer was moving or if he was moving.
Exactly. He genuinely couldn't tell. This is crucial because it foreshadows the loss of the central processor, the psychic coordinator. That usually separates me from that. The boundary between observer and observed was already starting to blur physically.
And then, the prophetic dream, which he later called a prelude to his own clinical death.
About a week after the casino incident, he had this dream in Geneva. He was bitten by a cobra, died instantly, was carried on a stretcher to the cremation ground, and woke up as his body was consumed by flames.
The significance here isn't religious, you think?
No, not for him. The significance isn't about Kundalini energy or anything like that. It's about the foreknowledge of the absolute cessation of the constructed self, the I, accompanied by the physical destruction of the old body. It was a preparation.
A preparation for what was coming. And the physical stress leading up to the main event was agonizing. He described 3 years of constant, unbearable pain in his brain.
The detail here really emphasizes the intensity. He was in such continuous, terrible cranial pain that he estimated he consumed literally thousands of aspirins, none of which provided any relief.
So what did he do?
He tried to manage the pain through sheer physical stimulation, consuming between 15 and 20 cups of coffee daily just to push through the agony. This wasn't just stress. It was the body reacting to an immense internal energy buildup, unable to process it.
And this buildup manifested as literal electrical phenomena.
Yes. During this 3-year period, his body became highly charged, almost electromagnetic. He reported that if he rubbed his palms together or rubbed any part of his skin, he could produce a spark or a strange phosphorus glow.
The system was just running on overload.
Totally on overload. The nervous system was taut, preparing for the rupture. He later suggested this was the body trying to adjust its internal chemistry, but the cultural structure of continuous thought was resisting it, and that created the pain.
All of this tension culminated in Tannenland, Switzerland in 1967, and the entire life search narrowed down to one specific final question.
Yes, he was sitting under a chestnut tree, and the question wasn't about the nature of the enlightened state, but the mechanism of confirmation.
And that subtle difference is everything.
It's the pin that burst the balloon. For 40 years, he had been pursuing the answer to what is that state? Nirvana, Satori, the state of the masters. But suddenly, the inquiry transformed into this demanding, relentless question. How do I know that I am in that state?
Why is that shift so critical?
Because it exposes the inherent circularity of the search. He realized that the only reason he believed he was in any spiritual state, peaceful, aware, detached, was because he knew what that state was supposed to look like from the scriptures, the gurus, the culture.
So the knowledge was projecting the experience.
The knowledge was projecting the experience. He saw the division. There was the experiencing and the knower. And the knower, the identity, was built entirely on borrowed concepts.
He said he hadn't moved one step in 40 years.
With a brutal clarity, yes, he was exactly where he started, trapped in a loop of self-deception fostered by the entire spiritual infrastructure.
And when this core insight struck, the question disappeared. What was the immediate violent consequence of the dissolution of that final thought?
It was instantaneous and overwhelmingly physical. The extinction of that core conceptual thought, the one holding the whole structure together, triggered what he called a nuclear explosion.
A genuine physiological event.
Yes, blasting through every single cell, nerve, and gland in his body.
And he intentionally labeled this a calamity. Why was that terminology so important to him?
To strip it of any romantic or mystical interpretation, he wasn't transported to a state of bliss or beatitude. He stressed that it was physical torture, a painful, violent, agonizing experience.
It was a disaster for the old one.
A total disaster. It was the physical organism desperately trying to cope with the sudden, uncontrolled release of unimaginable internal energy.
And the most profound result of this explosion was the shattering of the I, the psychic coordinator.
That central processor was destroyed. The continuous thread of thought, the linking mechanism that creates the illusion of a solid self, was broken forever.
So now thought only arises functionally.
Right. In response to an immediate demand like, what is the time? It discharges its energy and immediately burns itself up. It stops linking past, present, and future into a continuous, anxious narrative. The self-perpetuating, fascist mechanism of thought was liquidated.
Following the explosion, U.G underwent 7 days of rapid, irreversible change, which culminated in the permanent natural state. This wasn't a gradual process of understanding. He called it an alchemy in the body's chemistry.
And these shifts are the evidence he points to. On the very first day, his sense of touch changed radically. His skin became unusually sensitive, soft like silk, and observers noticed a slight, peculiar golden glow about him.
And the razor incident.
Yes, the softness was so extreme that when he tried to shave, the razor would simply slip off his skin. The blade could no longer find purchase. The body's structure had already fundamentally altered.
On the second day, we get the famous tomato soup anecdote, which shows the loss of immediate recognition.
This illustrates the declutched state. He could see the bowl and he could taste the soup, but without the psychic coordinator linking the visual input, the red liquid with memory tomato soup, and the verbal label, the knowledge just didn't surface automatically.
So he just kept asking, what is that?
Repeatedly. He'd look at it, ask, taste it, recognize the sensation, swallow, and immediately forget asking the question again. The memory was still there, but it required an external trigger or a functional need to pull it forward. It wasn't integrated into a continuous act of identity.
By the fourth day, his visual system was radically rewired, leading to the condition he called vistavision. This is a difficult concept to grasp. What exactly was he experiencing?
It was a terrifying distortion of depth perception and spatial awareness. The world appeared like a concave mirror. He said objects moving toward him, especially cars, felt as if they were moving into his physical body or passing right through him, rather than stopping short.
And things moving away seemed to come from inside him.
Exactly. This isn't just distorted vision, it's the loss of the brain's ability to centrally process distance and movement based on expectation and past knowledge. Without the eye interpreting, the raw sensory input felt overwhelming and disorienting.
And what was happening physically with his eyes?
His eyes themselves changed. He noted that his eyelids completely stopped blinking instinctively, remaining fixed for half an hour or more.
That's an incredible physiological change.
It is. His eyes, now functioning purely as sensitive optical instruments, were drawn only by movement, color, or brightness. They moved constantly like a sensitive camera, seeing everything, whether a beautiful mountain or a garbage can, with absolute, non-discriminating neutrality.
Because there was no internal cameraman deciding what was important.
No cameraman. And the sensory boundaries continued to collapse. By the fifth day, it was hearing.
All sound vibrations, a dog barking, a passing whistle, suddenly felt as if they originated inside his body.
Yes, not outside. Again, the boundary between internal and external experience dissolved because the coordinating entity that locates sound in external space was absent. Sound became a pure internal vibration, unfiltered and overwhelming.
And then the ultimate disintegration. The body itself disappeared on the sixth day. This must be the most challenging concept for a listener.
It speaks directly to his claim that the body is an idea constructed by thought. He was lying on a sofa and realized he could not create a complete image of his physical form. He looked at his hand and questioned its identity.
So the body only existed as isolated points of contact.
Exactly. Raw points of contact, the weight of his legs crossed, the sensation where his back touched the sofa, the pressure in his joints. Outside of these points, the body didn't feel present. Without the coordinator to stitch the sensory input together into the coherent, continuous picture we call my body, the physical form was simply a collection of floating sensations.
That sounds absolutely terrifying, and the agony peaked on the eighth day with the energy outburst.
That energy burst was the body's final massive recalibration. He described a tremendous outburst of energy that lasted for hours, shaking his body and the physical world around him. This wasn't a brief shock. This agonizing high energy process continued intermittently for 6 months as the body struggled to handle the radical changes.
And this pain was the mechanism of true, deep, permanent biological mutation.
Yes, the body's entire chemistry was shifting. We see physical, visible changes. His wrist joints experienced terrible, constant pain until they physically turned, altering his hand movements.
People saw these new hand positions and immediately called them mudras, right?
They did, the ancient mystical gestures. But U.G maintained it was simply his skeletal structure permanently correcting itself.
And crucially, the hormonal shifts. He claimed his sex hormones changed, leading to temporary, verifiable physical changes.
This is one of the most astonishing claims and the cornerstone of his biological argument. He reported that his sex hormones shifted so significantly that he developed a temporary breast on the left side of his chest, and his internal organs briefly mutated toward female organs.
We can't verify that clinically, of course.
No, we can't. But the detail in the sources regarding the observer's reports and his own physical discomfort lends immense weight to his insistence that the change was purely physiological, not spiritual. It demonstrated that the human organism, when released from the tyranny of thought, undergoes spontaneous, radical chemical transformation.
But didn't he also connect these changes to traditional religious iconography, only to strip them of their mysticism, the chakra phenomena?
Exactly. Physical swellings appeared and disappeared at the points that Indian tradition calls chakras. For instance, a hard blue medallion appeared on his chest, and a cobra shaped like the hood of an agraja formed physically at his throat and nose bridge, echoing traditional visual representations of Siva and the Buddha.
So how did he explain these religious markers without resorting to religion?
He connected them to the reactivation of dormant ductless glands. He famously linked the swelling on his chest, the area of the heart chakra, to the reactivation of the thymus gland.
Which is usually only active until puberty.
Right, then it shrinks and becomes dormant. Yuji asserted that when this gland spontaneously reactivated, it brought with it an extraordinary sensitivity, the ability to physically feel the pain or anguish of others. For him, every mystical phenomenon, every miracle, every symbol was merely the temporary manifestation of glandular or hormonal chemistry gone haywire under extreme pressure and then spontaneously correcting itself.
So if any guru claims to be experiencing Kundalini rising, Yuji would simply say, no, you've got a temporary endocrine surge causing localized inflammation.
To put it bluntly, yes, it is all chemistry. The body is the only reality.
That violent physiological experience became the single lens through which Yuji viewed the entire human condition. It led to a complete demolition of philosophy and psychology.
Yeah, starting with the first principle, thought is not a tool for wisdom, but an agent of destruction.
He asserts that thought is simply matter, a high-frequency vibration.
Right. It's not some ethereal mechanism for achieving higher understanding. It is purely a survival tool, and a destructive one at that. It can't capture the movement of life because the pace of life is too fast for the slow, sticky process of conceptual thought.
And he calls it fascist. That's a strong word for something as seemingly innocuous as thinking.
It is fascist because its sole purpose is self-preservation. It is a protective self-referential mechanism that ensures its own continuity, which in turn maintains the status quo of culture and society. If thought stops, culture, which is merely crystallized thought, collapses.
So thought aggressively fights any challenge to its reign.
Always. And this continuous thought process, this fascistic loop, is the creator of the illusion we call the you or the self.
The I is not a soul or an entity or a permanent fixture.
No, it's just a continuous narrative generated by thought linking up memory and sensory input. Every time a thought is born and links to the previous one, you are born. The moment you label anything, this is a red bag, I feel angry, that act creates the separative identity, the I.
So the I is just the space between two thoughts.
That's all it is. And if the I is just an illusion of continuity, then the natural state that he achieved through the calamity is radically simple.
It's the body functioning without the interference of that interloper thought.
Exactly. It is a state of not knowing, or what he termed an acausal state. The body, he insisted, is a marvelously intelligent, self-renewing, peaceful organism perfectly capable of survival. Thought only disrupts this natural intelligence.
This physiological definition of reality means that all traditional spiritual seeking becomes immediately pointless.
And counterproductive. His statement that no experience is new completely devalues centuries of mystical attainment.
It's a logical consequence of his core insight, isn't it?
It is. All experiences, mystical visions, blissful states, profound peace, ecstasy, are secondhand and thought-induced. You can only experience what you already possess knowledge of. If you read about nirvana being a state of utter quiet, your mind, being highly adaptive, can manufacture the neurological sensation that matches that expectation.
The search for the beyond is simply a projection created by the knowledge you have about it.
And since knowledge is finite, the experience is merely a repetition. The real beyond is only possible in the absence of the knower, the you.
This means religion, in his view, is essentially a mass neurological disorder.
He called it a neurological problem and a messy thing that has fundamentally worsened the human condition. He argues that all saviors have failed because their teachings create division and ultimately lead to violence. He cited massacres and wars committed in the name of God, Jesus, or even Buddha.
He said the values of brotherhood and compassion are divisive.
So divisive, they necessitate a continuous cycle of conflict. God itself, he claimed, is the most destructive invention of the mind, created out of primordial human fear, the fear of non-existence.
And what about the modern multi-billion-dollar self-improvement industry, the gurus, the psychologists, the coaches?
He dismissed all systems for attaining enlightenment yoga, meditation, awareness therapy as bunk and poppycock. He saw gurus as mere technocrats who sell shoddy goods, capitalizing on human gullibility.
He was particularly harsh on meditation.
Very. He argued that if practiced seriously, it is profoundly damaging to the brain, driving people crazy because they lock themselves into caves, trying to suppress the very life energy they are meant to express. Even sophisticated psychological terms like self-knowledge and self-actualization are rot.
Because there is no self to know or actualize.
There isn't. The conclusion is absolute. Psychological mutation is an impossible fantasy.
You cannot fundamentally change the structure of thought through thought.
No, you can't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The only transformation possible is a permanent physical, chemical change, the biological mutation he experienced.
Yeah.
This process liquidates the entire constructed structure, including the higher self and the soul. Any attempt at psychological change is merely redecorating the prison cell.
One of the most fascinating aspects of his state is the description of how the senses function without the central coordinator. If there's no I linking everything up, what is the experience of reality like?
It's a state of pure sensation, unfiltered and overwhelming. The body's senses operate independently in isolation. The eyes see, the ears hear, but there is no entity inside saying, that sound I am hearing is coming from that object I am seeing.
The cross referencing system is just defunct.
Gone. It is disorienting but functional. His eyes, as we discussed, act like a sensitive camera. They are drawn purely by movement, brightness, or color. They look without judgment or discrimination. Whether it is a beautiful snow-capped mountain or a pile of garbage, the visual system processes the input exactly the same way.
And this fundamental breakdown impacts human communication drastically.
He stated that true communication is only possible for simple, functional needs. Here is some money. Give me a half kilo of carrots. Anything beyond that, any discussion of abstract ideas, feelings, or philosophy is impossible.
Why?
Because you never actually listen to the other person. You only hear your own internal translation of the sound vibration, your own memorized words and ideas being activated by their external sound. You are, in effect, always talking to your own conditioning.
He also had that incredibly self-deprecating yet profound statement about his own state.
Yes. He openly admitted that since there is no center in him confirming coherence, he had no way of knowing he wasn't a raving maniac. He said the difference between him and a madman was only a hair's breadth.
Which shows a complete lack of self-validation.
Absolute. He didn't claim to possess ultimate truth. He simply stated the observable physiological facts of his current state.
U.G.'s clinical, uncompromising view of the body and thought structure leads to some of his most brutally cynical conclusions about society, ethics, and human interaction.
Right. He argues that the fundamental architecture of human relationships is fear and self-gratification, not love.
The year experiences a profound internal void, and relationships are just an attempt to fill that hole.
That's his take. So all relationships, including those with family members, are transactional at their core. He insisted they are built solely on the foundation of, what do I get out of this relationship?
A mechanism for mutual gratification.
And if that gratification ceases, the relationship goes sour. The moment one partner stops fulfilling the other's needs, the foundation collapses.
And what about marriage, that cornerstone of societal security?
Marriage, he argued, continues not out of some idealized concept of enduring love, but purely because of pragmatic necessities. The involvement of children, shared property, and the need for security. It is an institution sustained by dependency and external structures, not internal devotion.
He reserved his most blistering critique for the concept of love itself, calling it fascist.
This is a truly shocking claim. He called love the last card in the pack, the word used when all other forms of gratification fail. Since it is born out of the divisive consciousness, the I existing separately from the you, it inherently implies division and separation. Therefore, it is fascist in its nature.
Controlling and demanding compliance.
Yes. He went further, arguing that the commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, has been historically responsible for the killing of millions because it requires a division between those who are worthy of love, the you, and those who are not, the them. It demands a uniformity of affection that the body simply cannot supply naturally.
U.G. strips ethical judgment from many core human drives, starting with sex.
Yeah, in his view, sex is a purely biological function, yet thought turns it into a source of immense suffering and violence.
For the body, sex is simply for procreation, like hunger is for survival.
Right. But thought intervenes, turning it into a pleasure movement. Crucially, he argued that without the mental buildup, the memory, the anticipation, the cultural conditioning around greater and greater pleasure sex is impossible. And it's this thought-driven pursuit of pleasure that makes the act itself tremendously violent and painful to the otherwise peaceful organism of the body.
So, trying to suppress or sublimate sex, as many spiritual traditions suggest, is also pointless.
Absolutely pointless and harmful. If you suppress the sexual energy, it simply manifests elsewhere. He said that as long as you think of God, you will inevitably have thoughts of sex, because both are products of the same demanding, pleasure-seeking mind. The solution isn't sublimation. It's the cessation of the thought structure.
What about the virtue of selflessness? Society constantly tells us to strive for it.
UG provided the ultimate counterintuitive advice: be selfish, stay selfish. He maintained that man is always selfish, and the only result of trying to practice selflessness as a virtue is that he remains pathologically selfish, hiding his motives behind a moral veneer.
Wanting enlightenment is the ultimate selfishness.
Because it's the ultimate gratification. Desire itself is natural, rooted in the body's need for survival and comfort. Trying to impose a moral framework on natural desire is what creates neurosis and conflict.
And anger, that explosive emotion we are told to manage or control, is redefined as pure energy.
He insisted that anger is simply a tremendous outburst of energy, a natural physiological response to disequilibrium, not a psychological flaw. The energy is only problematic when thought interferes, taking the energy and converting it into a continuous state of resentment or hatred.
So if the body is left alone,
It can naturally absorb and dissipate this immense wave of energy. Trying to destroy the energy of anger through moralizing or therapeutic control actually destroys the very expression of life itself. It should be allowed to burn itself out naturally.
expanding this view globally, if religion is a neurological problem, where do politics and ideology fit in?
He called political structures the warty outgrowth of religious thinking. They are driven by the same mechanism of fear, division, and the need for a hierarchical value system. He asserted that all ideologies, revolutions, and political systems are doomed to fail because they only succeed in replacing one value system with another. The fundamental division remains.
If brotherhood, love, and ideology have all failed to unify mankind, what is the single terrifying force that he believed could enforce global cooperation?
The terror of extinction. UG maintained that mankind will only be saved not by sentiment, but by the overwhelming, undeniable realization of self preservation.
The simple truth that if I try to destroy you, I will also be destroyed.
That is the only thing capable of enforcing cooperation on a global scale. This understanding has to percolate down to the level of basic human consciousness, mirroring the biological mechanism where every cell in the body cooperates because it knows the death of its neighbor means its own death. Survival, pure and simple.
This focus on survival leads to his distinct perspective on mortality, separating the death of the constructed you from the end of the body.
Right. The body, in his view, is essentially immortal in its physical components. It simply changes form, returning to the continuous flow of life. It is not concerned with an afterlife. It only seeks to survive and procreate now.
So the fear of death is entirely invented by the you.
By the memory structure, yes, because the identity cannot conceive of its own non existence. This fear forces us to invent heaven, reincarnation, or an afterlife to maintain the illusion of continuity, all of which are simply projections of the thought structure trying to survive.
Finally, UG applied his scalpel to some of the most cherished concepts of culture and personal development, labeling them as functional absurdities.
Starting with the pursuit of self knowledge.
Understanding yourself is one of the greatest jokes.
That's it. A farce perpetuated by gurus and psychologists alike, who endlessly peddle self knowledge, self actualization, living from moment to moment, and such rot. This deliberate self inquiry is precisely what takes you further away from the natural state, because it strengthens the false self that is doing the seeking.
And his view of pain runs contrary to modern medical urgency.
Pain is not a metaphysical problem, and it's not a disaster. It is a healing process. It signals a disequilibrium in the body, and the body has its own highly intelligent mechanisms for working that out.
But we're too afraid to let it.
We are. We run immediately to doctors and medication to suppress the symptom. We interfere with the natural healing process because we believe the I knows better than the organism itself.
He also had a wonderfully cynical clinical assessment of art and creativity.
Artists, poets, and musicians are merely technicians or craftsmen who use their developed skills to express the fundamental sensuality of man. They are no different in function from a highly skilled carpenter or mason.
They're just selling their output through a cultured, market-driven system.
And that system has created a need for this kind of gratification. His ultimate conclusion on this front was that computers will eventually paint and create music far better than any human, because humans are themselves just sophisticated machines operating based on conditioning. A computer is just a more efficient machine.
So he strips all transcendence and intrinsic value from the human act of creation. It's just technique and market function.
Exactly. Everything that is valued by the mind is based on comparison, memory, and culture. If it is not purely functional, it is merely a distraction invented by the you.
We've taken a radical deep dive, tracing UG's journey from intense spiritual air to the man who exploded the very concept of spiritual search. His sources give us a truly clinical, physiological critique of human existence.
And his central, shocking conclusion remains. Human misery is the direct result of the search for non-existent goals, which are perpetuated by continuous fascist thought. The natural state is not achieved, it is already present.
It's the body, a highly sensitive, intelligent biological machine functioning perfectly.
But only when the constructed, thought-generated self collapses entirely, chemically, and permanently.
And this leads us directly to his most famous and perhaps most frustrating assertion,
Mm-hmm.
the no message message. He insisted there is no teaching of mine and never shall be one. He had no path, no message, and nothing to give.
Uh-huh.
Why was it so vital for him to make this absolute disclaimer?
Because any attempt to follow, organize, or structure his words immediately turns them into a belief system, a new path, and a new goal, and thus instantly destroys the potential for a biological shift.
So he only spoke because people came to him.
Right, they came seeking understanding, but his entire motive was to make it crystal clear that there is nothing to understand. Any organized attempt to preserve his words, he argued, would instantly turn him into a false model, which he absolutely rejected. He saw himself as merely an automaton, responding mechanically to external stimuli,
A mirror reflecting the questioner's own conditioning.
not a source of ultimate truth.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to carry forward. If UG is correct that the you seeking knowledge, the identity trying to be better, wiser, or more selfless, is precisely the obstacle preventing you from functioning naturally, then how can you stop seeking without making stopping itself a new form of seeking, a new spiritual goal?
Consider this carefully. If every concept of personal improvement is rooted in the continuous motion of thought, what everyday decision or action, stripped entirely of intention or measurement, might actually change your body's chemistry, that raw physical organism, rather than simply changing the content of your mind.
If all answers are dead answers, born of dead knowledge, and the only living thing is the present physiological response, how would you behave differently in the next 5 minutes?
That's the question.
That is a fundamental challenge to the very idea of self-control. Thanks for joining us on this radical deep dive into the man who insisted he was not enlightened, but biologically calibrated.